In the harsh Wyoming Territory of 1,891, where winter winds cut through a man's soul as easily as his coat, Silas Thorne built an empire on ice and iron will. The richest cattle baron for 300 miles, he earned his nickname, the Glacier, not just for his fortune, but for the frost that seemed to live permanently in his steel-grey eyes. No one dared approach him. No one even tried, until Josie Belle Whitaker rode onto his ranch with a pronounced limp, a sharp tongue, and absolutely no fear of his legendary coldness. She came to work his wildest horses, but what she found was a man more broken than any bronco she'd ever faced. But could a cowgirl with her own painful past truly melt a heart that had been frozen solid for over a decade? The morning sun cast long shadows across Thorn Ridge Ranch as Silas Thorne emerged from the main house, his boots striking the wooden porch with the measured precision of a man who had long ago learned that every step mattered. At 42, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen too much of life's harsh truths and had chosen to meet them head-on rather than bend. His steel-grey eyes swept across the sprawling expanse of his empire, 30,000 acres of prime Wyoming grazing land, countless head of cattle, and buildings that spoke of prosperity built through sheer force of will. The ranch hands were already at work, their movements efficient and purposeful under his distant supervision. They respected him, perhaps even feared him a little, but none would claim to know him. That was exactly how Silas preferred it. Personal connections were luxuries he could no longer afford, lessons learned through fire and loss that had forged him into the man the townspeople called the Glacier. He pulled his pocket watch from his vest, a habit that had survived from happier times, 6:30 in the morning, just as it had been every day for the past 12 years. Routine was armor, predictability was safety, and emotions were enemies to be conquered through discipline and distance. The foreman, Buck Morrison, approached with the easy gait of a man who had worked these lands for over a decade. Buck was one of the few who remembered Silas before the tragedy that had transformed a laughing, generous young rancher into this monument of controlled fury and careful isolation. "Morning, Mr. Thorne," Buck said, touching the brim of his hat. "Cattle in the north pasture are looking good. Weather's been favorable." Silas nodded, his attention already moving to the next concern. "What about the horses Henderson brought in last week?" "Still giving us trouble. That stallion in particular, thunder his mean as a rattlesnake and twice as unpredictable. Thrown 3 of our best riders already. Might be time to consider him a lost cause." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Silas had built his reputation on never accepting defeat, on finding ways to break through problems that others deemed impossible. It was this relentless determination that had transformed a modest inheritance into one of the largest cattle operations in Wyoming Territory. But it was also this same drive that had once cost him everything that truly mattered. "Give him another week," Silas said finally. "Sometimes the wildest ones just need someone who understands their language." Buck's weathered face creased with something that might have been a smile. "Yes, sir. Speaking of which, we might have found someone who could help with that situation." Silas turned, his attention sharpening. Buck Morrison was not a man given to idle suggestions or hasty recommendations. If he was bringing someone to Silas's attention, there was substance behind it. "There's a cowgirl been making a name for herself down in Cheyenne, Josie Belle Whitaker. Heard tell she's got away with difficult horses that borders on magical. Problem is..." Buck paused, clearly weighing his words. "Problem is what?" "Well, sir, she's got what some folks might call a disability. Took a bad fall when she was young, left her with a permanent limp. Some of the boys might not take kindly to..." "Buck." Silas's voice carried the quiet authority that had built his empire. "I don't pay my men to have opinions about who I hire. I pay them to do their jobs. If this woman can handle horses that my best riders can't, then her personal circumstances are irrelevant." The foreman nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced the other ranch hands would share their employer's pragmatic approach. "She's supposed to be coming through this way next week, looking for work. Word is her family's ranch is struggling, and she needs steady employment." Silas turned back toward the main house, his mind already moving to other concerns. The conversation had stirred something in him, thou faint echo of memory from a time when he too had been willing to take chances on people others had written off. His late wife, Margaret, had possessed that same quality, seeing potential where others saw only problems. The thought of Margaret brought the familiar tightness to his chest, the weight of grief that 12 years had only taught him to carry more efficiently, not to eliminate. She had been everything bright and warm in his world, the light that had made him believe in possibilities beyond mere survival. When consumption had taken her during their third winter together, it had carved out a hollow space in his soul that he had filled with work, responsibility, and a determination never again to risk that kind of devastating loss. The deed to Thornridge Ranch hung framed in his study, but Silas rarely looked at it anymore. He knew every word by heart, every legal description of boundary and water right. That document represented more than property ownership. It was proof of what a man could accomplish when he channeled grief into ambition, when he chose building over breaking. As he walked toward the stables, Silas caught sight of his reflection in a window and was momentarily struck by how much he resembled his own father in those final years. The elder Thorne had been a hard man, made harder by the demands of frontier life and the loss of his own wife. Silas had sworn he would be different, had promised Margaret he would always choose love over fear, connection over isolation. How quickly life could make liars of even the most sincere intentions. The morning air carried the scent of hay and leather, the sounds of cattle and horses, the low conversations of men beginning another day of honest work. This was his world now, built from the ashes of dreams that had once included shared laughter and children's voices echoing through the halls of the big house. He had created something substantial and enduring, but it was a monument to solitude rather than a home filled with life. In town, people spoke of Silas Thorne with respect tinged by wariness. He was fair in his business dealings, prompt with his payments, and reliable in his commitments. But he was also distant, unreachable, a man who seemed to exist behind walls of his own construction. The nickname the Glacier had started as a reference to his wealth and power, but it had evolved to capture something more essential about his nature, beautiful, formidable, and utterly untouchable. The irony was not lost on him that his very success had become another form of prison. Every acre he acquired, every head of cattle he added to his herds, every building he constructed on his landel of it, served to reinforce his isolation from the world of ordinary human connection. He had become too wealthy to be approached casually, too powerful to be seen as anything other than a force to be reckoned with, too guarded to allow anyone close enough to discover the man who still existed beneath the carefully constructed facade. As the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across his domain, Silas returned to the house to review the day's business correspondence. Letters from livestock dealers, reports from his foreman in distant pastures, financial statements that confirmed his continued prosperity, all the communications of a man who had reduced life to its most manageable, least vulnerable elements. But Buck's mention of the cowgirl with the limp had planted something in his mind, a small seed of curiosity that he couldn't quite dismiss. Perhaps it was simply the practical consideration of solving the problem with the difficult horses. Perhaps it was something else entirely, some buried part of him that still remembered what it felt like to be surprised by another person's strength and determination. Either way, he found himself looking forward to next week with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years, though he would never have admitted it to himself or anyone else. After all, even glaciers could be moved by forces patient and persistent enough to find their hidden vulnerabilities. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Silas was reviewing feed calculations in his study when Buck's urgent knock interrupted his concentration. The foreman's weathered face carried an expression Silas had rarely seen, part amusement, part bewilderment, and something that might have been admiration. "Mr. Thorne, you need to see this." Silas followed Buck onto the front porch, his eyes immediately drawn to the approaching rider. Even from a distance, there was something distinctive about the figure on horseback, the way they sat their mount with casual confidence, the easy rhythm of movement that spoke of someone born to the saddle. As the rider drew closer, details became clearer, and Silas found himself studying the scene with growing interest. The woman, for it was clearly a woman despite her practical riding clothes and wide-brimmed hatrode, a sturdy bay mare, with the kind of partnership that came from years of mutual trust. Her posture was straight, her hands light on the reins, and when she turned to survey the ranch buildings, Silas caught a glimpse of a face that was both striking and determined. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with sun-touched skin and hair, the color of autumn wheat pulled back in a practical braid. "That would be Josie Belle Whitaker," Buck said quietly. "Heard she was coming, but didn't expect her to just ride up bold as brass." The woman dismounted near the main corral, and it was then that Silas noticed the slight favor she gave to her left leg, the careful way she stepped down from her horse. The limp Buck had mentioned was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of accommodation a person made so naturally it became part of their grace rather than a hindrance to it. Several ranch hands had stopped their work to watch the newcomer, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. It wasn't uncommon for drifters to seek work, but it was unusual for anyone to arrive with such confident bearing, and virtually unheard of for that person to be a woman traveling alone. Josie tied her horse to the fence rail and approached the group of men with purposeful strides. Her worn leather gloves were pushed back on her hands, and Silas could see that her clothing, while practical and well-maintained, spoke of someone accustomed to hard work and careful economy. These were garments chosen for function over fashion, mended and remended, with the kind of attention that came from necessity rather than choice. "I'm looking for work," she announced to the assembled ranch hands, her voice carrying easily across the distance. "Heard tell you folks have some horses need handling." Tommy Richardson, one of the younger hands, stepped forward with the kind of swagger that often preceded poor judgment. "Lady, this isn't exactly parlor work we're talking about. These animals have already put 3 good men in the dirt." Josie's response was to smile, but it wasn't the demure expression Tommy might have expected. Instead, it was the kind of smile that suggested she had heard this particular speech before and found it mildly entertaining rather than intimidating. "Well then," she said, adjusting her hat brim against the afternoon sun, "sounds like you need someone who knows what they're doing instead of just pretending they do." The comment drew chuckles from some of the older hands, men who had seen enough of life to appreciate directness over diplomacy. Tommy's face reddened, but before he could respond, Silas found himself walking down from the porch, his curiosity overriding his usual preference for observing from a distance. "Miss Whitaker, I presume," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become second nature to him. "I'm Silas Thorne." She turned to face him fully, and Silas was struck by her eyes green as spring grass, intelligent and direct, showing no trace of the deference or nervousness that most people displayed when meeting him for the first time. She studied him with the same frank assessment he was giving her, as if she were measuring his character rather than his reputation. "Mr. Thorne," she touched the brim of her hat in acknowledgement, "I understand you've got a stallion that's been causing some difficulty. Among others. The question is whether you can succeed where experienced men have failed." "The question," Josie replied evenly, "is whether you want someone who can actually solve your problem, or whether you want someone who'll tell you what you expect to hear while your horses stay wild and your men stay frustrated." The directness of her response created a moment of absolute silence among the gathered ranch hands. No one spoke to Silas Thorne with such frank challenge, certainly not someone seeking employment. Buck Morrison's eyebrows had climbed nearly to his hairline, and Tommy Richardson looked as if he were witnessing something that bordered on the supernatural. But instead of the cold dismissal that everyone expected, Silas found himself genuinely intrigued. It had been years since anyone had surprised him, longer still since someone had spoken to him, as if he was simply another person, rather than a force of nature to be carefully managed. "Show me," he said simply. The group moved toward the corral where Thunder waited, his black coat gleaming in the afternoon sun and his eyes rolling white at the approach of so many people. The stallion was magnificent, nearly 17 hands of pure power and fury, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even when he was standing still. 3 separate ropes bore testament to recent attempts to work with him, and his agitation was evident in every line of his muscular frame. "Who's been working with him?" Josie asked, her voice now businesslike and focused. "Every man here's tried at least once," Buck replied. "Horse seems to take it personal-like." Josie studied the stallion for several long minutes, her eyes taking in details that others might have missed. She noted the way he held his head, the tension in his shoulders, the small scars that suggested a history of harsh treatment before he had arrived at Thorn Ridge. "He's been hurt," she said finally. "Not recently, but deep enough that he remembers. Someone used force where they should have used patience, and now he's decided that all humans are enemies until proven otherwise." She approached the corral fence slowly, her movements deliberate and unthreatening. Thunder watched her approach, his ears pricked forward with wary interest rather than the immediate aggression he had shown to others. "Easy, handsome," she murmured, her voice carrying a quality that seemed to settle something in the air around them. "Nobody here wants to hurt you, just want to have a conversation." What happened next was unlike anything the assembled men had witnessed. Without entering the corral, without even reaching through the fence, Josie began what could only be described as a dialogue with the stallion. She spoke to him in low, musical tones, sometimes in English, sometimes in what sounded like nonsense syllables that somehow conveyed meaning despite their lack of conventional words. Thunder's posture began to change. The rigid tension in his neck relaxed slightly, and his eyes, while still watchful, lost some of their wild edge. He moved closer to the fence, drawn by something in her voice or manner that seemed to reach past his defensive fury to some deeper part of his nature. "I'll be damned," whispered one of the older hands. "Look at that." After perhaps 10 minutes of this extraordinary conversation, Thunder was standing close enough to the fence that Josie could have reached out and touched him, though she made no move to do so. Instead, she stepped back, her attention returning to the watching men. "He'll work," she said with quiet confidence, "but not the way you've been trying. This horse doesn't need to be broken. He needs to be convinced that partnership is possible. Give me a week, and I'll have him carrying a saddle. Give me 2, and he'll be the best mount on your ranch." Silas found himself faced with a decision that felt more significant than simple employment. There was something about this woman that challenged not just his expectations about horse training, but his carefully maintained assumptions about the nature of strength and capability. She had walked onto his ranch and accomplished in minutes what his most experienced men had failed to achieve in weeks. "The job pays $30 a month plus room and board," he heard himself saying, though he had not consciously decided to make the offer. "40, Josie replied without hesitation, "plus care for my horse, and I'll need Sundays off to visit my father." The negotiation was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of the usual pleading or gratitude that accompanied job offers, that Silas almost smiled. Here was someone who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to state it clearly. "Done." He extended his hand, and she shook it with a grip that was firm, without trying to prove anything. "Buck will show you to the bunkhouse and get you settled." As the group began to disperse, Silas caught himself lingering, watching as Josie gathered her few belongings and followed Buck toward the workers' quarters. There was something about her presence that had shifted the very atmosphere of his ranch, introduced an element of possibility that had been absent for longer than he cared to calculate. For the first time in 12 years, Silas Thorne found himself genuinely curious about what tomorrow might bring. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering that part of him actually wanted to see what lay beyond the safety of solid ground. The first light of dawn found Josie Belle Whitaker already at the corral, moving through her morning routine with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making the most of every daylight hour. She had arrived at Thorn Ridge Ranch only 3 days ago. But she had already begun to establish patterns that spoke of both professionalism and an understanding that she was being watched and evaluated by every person on the property. Silas observed her from his study window, a habit he had developed without quite admitting to himself. There was something compelling about the way she approached her work, methodical yet intuitive, confident without being reckless. She moved around the horses with the kind of natural grace that made her slight limp seem like nothing more than a personal characteristic, no more limiting than the color of her eyes or the sound of her voice. This morning she was working with a mare named Starlight, one of the ranch's more temperamental animals. The horse had been giving the other hands trouble for weeks, refusing to accept a saddle and shying away from anyone who approached with obvious intent to ride. But under Josie's patient guidance, Starlight stood calmly while the saddle was positioned and secured, her ears forward and her posture relaxed. "Easy does it, girl," Josie murmured, her voice carrying that same musical quality that had so effectively calmed thunder. "Nobody's asking you to be perfect right away, just asking you to trust that we're all on the same side here." Buck Morrison approached the corral, his expression a mixture of professional interest and grudging admiration. Over the past 3 days, he had watched this newcomer accomplish more with the difficult horses than his entire crew had managed in the preceding month. It was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the skepticism that had been his initial response to her arrival. "Morning, Miss Whitaker," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "See, you've got Starlight cooperating." Josie looked up from adjusting the mare's bridle, her green eyes bright with satisfaction. "She's a smart one. Just needed someone to listen to what she was trying to say, instead of telling her what she ought to be feeling." The comment carried implications that extended beyond horse training, though Buck wasn't entirely sure whether Josie intended the broader meaning or was simply focused on the task at hand. Either way, her approach was producing results that spoke for themselves. "Mr. Thorne's been asking about Thunder," Buck said, nodding toward the separate corral where the black stallion stood in solitary magnificence. "Wondering how long before you think he'll be ready for actual riding." Josie followed his gaze to where Thunder waited, his powerful frame catching the morning light. Over the past 3 days, she had spent hours simply being present near his corral, sometimes talking to him, sometimes working with other horses while he watched, always maintaining the patient consistency that seemed to be the foundation of her method. "He's ready now if I wanted to force the issue," she said thoughtfully, "but forced cooperation isn't the same as genuine partnership. Give me until the end of the week, and he'll carry a rider because he chooses to, not because he's been beaten into submission." The distinction was lost on some of the ranch hands, but Buck had been around horses long enough to understand the difference. A horse that worked from fear might perform adequately under normal circumstances, but would be unreliable when conditions became challenging. A horse that worked from trust would give everything it had, even in the worst situations. As if summoned by their conversation, Thunder moved to the fence rail closest to where they stood, his dark eyes fixed on Josie with an intensity that was remarkable to witness. The change in his demeanor over just 3 days was nothing short of extraordinary. Where once there had been wild fury and defensive aggression, now there was alert interest and something that looked remarkably like anticipation. "He's taken quite a shine to you," Buck observed. "We understand each other," Josie replied simply. "Both of us have learned that the world can be a hard place, but we've also learned that giving up isn't an option." The personal revelation was offered so casually that Buck almost missed its significance. But there was something in her tone, a note of hard-won wisdom, that suggested her own journey had included its share of challenges and setbacks. He found himself wondering about the injury that had left her with the limp, about the circumstances that had brought her to Thorn Ridge seeking employment, about the family ranch Buck had heard was struggling financially. "If you don't mind my asking," he said carefully, "how'd you develop this particular skill with horses? It's not something you see every day." Josie was quiet for a moment, her attention seemingly focused on Starlight's bridle, but Buck sensed she was deciding how much of her story to share. When she finally spoke, Her voice carried the reflective quality of someone revisiting old memories. "Started when I was 8 years old," she said. "Took a bad fall from a horse that was too much for me to handle, but my pride was too big for me to admit it. Broke my leg in 3 places, and it never quite healed right." She gestured briefly toward her left leg, the movement matter-of-fact rather than self-conscious. "Spent months laid up, watching other people work with horses, thinking about what I'd done wrong and what I might do different if I got another chance. When I was finally able to walk again, I decided I was going to understand horses well enough that falling wouldn't be necessary anymore." The story explained much about her approach: the patience, the careful observation, the emphasis on communication over dominance. It also revealed a strength of character that Buck was beginning to recognize as fundamental to who she was. Not everyone who faced that kind of setback would have chosen to get back on a horse at all, much less dedicate themselves to mastering the relationship between human and animal. "Must have been hard on your family seeing you hurt like that." "Papa blamed himself for letting me try to ride a horse he knew was beyond my experience," Josie said, her voice softening with affection. "Mama spent weeks sitting by my bed, reading to me and bringing me books about horses when she could afford them. They both made it clear that they'd support whatever I decided to do next, whether that was staying away from horses entirely or learning to do it better." The mention of her parents brought a shadow to her expression, a brief flicker of concern that she tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. Buck had heard rumors about her family's financial difficulties, whispers that the Whitaker ranch was struggling with debt and that her father's health was failing. It would explain why a woman with her evident skills was seeking employment rather than working her own family's land. From his window, Silas continued to observe the conversation, though he was too far away to hear the words being exchanged. What he could see was the way Buck's posture had changed, from professional politeness to genuine interest, the way Josie's responses seemed to be building a bridge of mutual respect between them. It was a dynamic he hadn't witnessed in years. She's foreman, actually engaging with a new employee as a person rather than simply as another set of hands to manage. The sight stirred something in Silas that he wasn't quite prepared to examine. For years, his ranch had operated like a well-oiled machine, efficient and productive, but somehow lacking in the kind of human warmth that had once characterized the place. Margaret had been the heart of that warmth, the person who had transformed a business operation into something that felt like a community. After her death, Silas had allowed that warmth to fade, focusing instead on the practical necessities of running a successful enterprise. But Josie's presence was already beginning to restore something he hadn't realized he'd lost. He could see it in the way the other ranch hands paused in their work to watch her interactions with the horses, in the subtle changes in their conversations during meals, in the general sense that something interesting was happening at Thorn Ridge Ranch for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. As he watched, Tommy Richardson approached the corral with the swagger that had become his trademark since Josie's arrival. The young hand had not taken well to being shown up by a woman, and his resentment had been evident in his interactions with her over the past few days. Silas couldn't hear the words being exchanged, but he could read the body language clearly enough. Tommy's aggressive posture, Josie's calm but alert response, Buck's warning presence as he positioned himself between them. Whatever Tommy said brought a flush of color to Josie's cheeks, but her response was delivered with the kind of controlled composure that suggested she had dealt with this type of challenge before. Buck's intervention was swift and decisive, and within moments Tommy was walking away with the stiff-backed gait of someone who had been firmly put in his place. Silas found himself feeling a surge of protective anger toward Josie, followed immediately by surprise at the strength of his own reaction. When had he begun to care about the personal comfort of his employees beyond their ability to perform their assigned tasks? When had their individual stories begun to matter to him as anything more than factors that might affect their productivity? The questions were uncomfortable ones, suggesting that Josie Belle Whitaker was having an impact on his carefully ordered world that extended far beyond her considerable skill with horses. She was reminding him of aspects of himself that he had deliberately suppressed, stirring feelings and impulses that he had convinced himself were better left buried. As the morning progressed and he finally forced himself to turn away from the window, Silas carried with him the image of Josie working with thunder, her voice low and encouraging, her movements patient and sure. There was something about the scene that felt like a promise of possibilities he had stopped allowing himself to imagine, a suggestion that the future might hold more than just the successful management of livestock and land. For the first time in years, the prospect filled him with anticipation rather than resignation. The portrait hung in Silas's private study, positioned where he could see it from his desk, but hidden from casual visitors by the angle of the room and the way the afternoon light fell across the far wall. Margaret Thorne gazed out from the ornate frame with the gentle smile that had first captured his heart 15 years ago, her dark hair arranged in the fashion of the day, her eyes holding the warmth and intelligence that had made every day of their brief marriage feel like a gift. Silas rarely looked at the painting directly anymore, but he was always aware of its presence, the way a man might be conscious of an old wound that had healed but never quite stopped aching. This evening, however, as he reviewed the day's correspondence, he found his attention drawn repeatedly to Margaret's painted face, as if she might offer guidance for the confusion that had begun to characterize his thoughts. It had been 2 weeks since Josie Belle Whitaker's arrival, and in that time she had accomplished what Silas was beginning to recognize as nothing short of a minor miracle. Not only had she successfully worked with Thunder the Stallion, now carried a saddle and rider with remarkable cooperation, but she had also made significant progress with every difficult horse on the ranch. More unsettling, from Silas's perspective, was the way her presence had begun to change the entire atmosphere of the place. The ranch hands worked with more enthusiasm, their conversations during meals carried laughter that had been absent for years, and there was a general sense of anticipation about what Josie might accomplish next. Even Buck Morrison, who had managed the ranch's daily operations with competent professionalism for over a decade, seemed to have discovered new energy and purpose in his work. And Silas himself was forced to acknowledge that he looked forward to each day with an eagerness that had nothing to do with business concerns and everything to do with the possibility of encountering Josie's particular blend of competence, humor, and unexpected insight. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying, suggesting as it did that his carefully constructed emotional defenses were proving inadequate against the simple fact of her presence in his life. A knock at the study door interrupted his brooding. Buck Morrison entered at Silas's invitation, his hat in his hands and his expression carrying the weight of serious news. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Thorne, but we've got a situation developing that you need to know about." Silas set aside his papers, his attention immediately focused on his foreman's concerns. "What kind of situation?" "Had a visitor today while you were in town. Fellow named Carson Blackwood, claims to represent some kind of land development company. He was asking questions about property boundaries, water rights, that sort of thing. But he was also nosing around, talking to the hands, asking about our operations." The name was unfamiliar, but the description was enough to put Silas on alert. Wyoming Territory was experiencing increased interest from Eastern investors, men with more money than understanding who saw the vast open spaces as opportunities for quick profit rather than the complex ecosystems they actually represented. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing beyond common courtesy required, but he wasn't really interested in talking to me anyway. Spent most of his time trying to get information out of the hands, particularly the newer ones, who might not know better than to keep their mouths shut." Buck paused, his weathered face creasing with concern. "There's something else, Mr. Thorne. He was asking specifically about Miss Whitaker's family ranch. Seemed to know quite a bit about their financial situation already." The news hit Silas like a physical blow, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Over the past 2 weeks, he had begun to piece together the reality of Josie's circumstances through casual comments and careful observation. Her family's ranch was struggling, her father's health was declining, and the financial pressures were severe enough to force her into seeking employment, despite her obvious preference for independence. Did he approach Miss Whitaker directly? Tried to. She was working with the horses when he showed up, and she made it clear she wasn't interested in conversation. But he lingered around the property for a good hour, watching her work, asking questions about her background and her family situation. The thought of this stranger observing Josie, evaluating her as if she was simply another asset to be catalogued and potentially exploited, filled Silas with a cold fury that surprised him with its intensity. When had her welfare become so important to him? When had the idea of someone threatening her peace of mind become something he took personally? "I want to know more about this Carson Blackwood," Silas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built his empire. "Find out who he really represents, what his company's interests are in this area, and why he's targeting struggling ranchers specifically." "Already sent word to our contacts in Cheyenne," Buck replied. "Should have information within a few days." As Buck prepared to leave, Silas found himself asking, "How is Miss Whitaker handling this situation?" The foreman's expression softened slightly, with more grace than it deserves, if you ask me, but I can tell it's weighing on her. She's been even more focused on her work than usual, if that's possible, and she's been making trips to visit her father more frequently. After Buck's departure, Silas remained in his study, staring at Margaret's portrait and wrestling with emotions he had spent 12 years learning to suppress. The protective instinct he felt toward Josie was undeniable, but it was complicated by feelings that went far beyond simple employer concern for employee welfare. Over the past 2 weeks, their interactions had been limited but significant. Brief conversations about the horse's progress, professional discussions about ranch operations, casual exchanges during the communal meals that were part of ranch life. But each encounter had revealed new layers to her character, her quick intelligence, her gentle humor, her unshakable integrity in the face of challenges that would have broken lesser spirits. More troubling was his growing awareness of her physical presence, the way her laughter could transform his mood, the graceful efficiency of her movements as she worked with the horses, the moments when their eyes met across the dinner table and he felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with possibilities he had convinced himself were no longer available to him. The next morning brought Josie to his door, her expression serious and her usual confident bearing shadowed by worry. She stood in the doorway of his study, her hat in her hands and her green eyes reflecting a vulnerability she rarely allowed others to see. "Mr. Thorne, I need to speak with you about something, and I'm hoping you'll hear me out before you make any decisions." Silas gestured toward the chair across from his desk, noting the way she favored her left leg slightly more than usual, a sign he had learned to recognize that she was either tired or stressed beyond her normal capacity to compensate. "I understand someone was here yesterday asking questions about my family's situation," she began, her voice steady but carefully controlled. "I want you to know that whatever problems my father's ranch might be facing, they won't interfere with my work here. I've never brought personal troubles to a job site, and I don't intend to start now." The speech had obviously been rehearsed, delivered with the kind of determined professionalism that suggested she had spent considerable time preparing for this conversation. But beneath the surface composure, Silas could see the strain she was under, the weight of responsibility that was pressing down on someone who had already shouldered more than her fair share of life's burdens. "Miss Whitaker," he said gently, "your personal circumstances are your own business, unless you choose to make them otherwise. But if there's anything I can do to help—" "I appreciate that, Mr. Thorne, I truly do. But I need this job to stand on its own merits, not on charity or pity. I'm good at what I do, and I believe I've proven that over the past 2 weeks. That needs to be enough." The quiet dignity of her response only deepened Silas's respect for her, even as it frustrated his growing desire to offer whatever assistance might ease her burden. Here was someone who understood the value of independence, who refused to allow circumstances beyond her control to compromise her sense of self-worth. "You've more than proven your value here," he assured her. "But if these land developers are pressuring your family, then that's something my father and I will handle together." She interrupted, though not unkindly. "We've faced difficult times before, and we'll face whatever comes next with the same determination that's brought us this far." As she prepared to leave, Silas found himself making a decision that would have surprised him just a month earlier. "Miss Whitaker, Would you be available to join me for dinner this evening? There are some aspects of ranch operations I'd like to discuss with you, and I think you might have valuable insights to offer." The invitation hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to acknowledge openly. Josie's green eyes searched his face for several long moments, as if trying to determine whether this was simply a professional courtesy or something more personal. "I'd be honored, Mr. Thorne," she said finally. "Shall I come to the main house around 7? After she left, Silas sat alone in his study, acutely aware of Margaret's painted gaze and the magnitude of what he had just done. For the first time in 12 years, he had invited someone into his private space, not as a business associate or casual acquaintance, but as someone whose company he genuinely desired. The prospect filled him with equal measures of anticipation and terror, the sense that he was standing at the edge of territory he had sworn never to explore again. But Josie Belle Whitaker had already proven herself capable of accomplishing things that others deemed impossible, and perhaps, just perhaps, she might also be capable of helping him rediscover parts of himself he had thought were lost forever. The envelope arrived with the morning mail, its official appearance and unfamiliar return address immediately catching Josie's attention as she sorted through correspondence in the ranch's small office. The paper was expensive, the printing formal, and the contents, when she finally summoned the courage to open it, confirmed her worst fears about her father's deteriorating situation. Medical bills. Another stack of them, this time from the specialist in Cheyenne, who had been treating her father's failing heart. The numbers swam before her eyes, each figure representing not just money her family didn't have, but time that might be running out faster than any of them had anticipated. She sat at the small desk, staring at the papers spread before her, calculating and recalculating sums that never seemed to add up to anything approaching manageable. Her salary from Thorn Ridge Ranch was more than she had ever earned before, but it was still a fraction of what would be needed to address the mounting financial crisis, threatening to consume everything her family had worked to build. Outside the office window, she could see the ranch hands beginning their daily routines, the familiar rhythm of work that had become a source of stability in her increasingly uncertain world. In just 3 weeks, Thorn Ridge had begun to feel like more than temporary employment. It felt like a place where she could envision building something lasting, where her skills were valued and her contributions made a genuine difference. The irony was not lost on her that just as she had found work that fulfilled her professionally and personally, circumstances beyond her control were threatening to pull her away from it. A shadow fell across the doorway, and she looked up to see Carson Blackwood standing there, with the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was a man of medium height and unremarkable features, but there was something about his presence that immediately put her on edge, a quality of watchful calculation that suggested he was always evaluating people and situations for potential advantage. "Miss Whitaker, I hope you don't mind my stopping by. I was hoping we might have a conversation about your family's situation." Josie's immediate instinct was to refuse, but something in his manner suggested this was not a casual social call. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Blackwood, isn't it? I believe my foreman mentioned you'd been asking questions around the ranch. I represent interests that might be able to help your family through what I understand are some difficult financial circumstances," he said, settling into the chair with practiced ease. "I know this must be a stressful time, trying to manage your father's medical needs while maintaining the ranch operations." The casual reference to her father's health sent a chill through Josie. This stranger knew far more about her personal situation than any legitimate business inquiry would require, which meant he had been investigating her family with deliberate thoroughness. "I'm not sure what you think you know about my family's affairs, but they're not really subject for discussion with strangers." Blackwood's smile widened, but it remained entirely without warmth. "Miss Whitaker, I understand your reluctance to discuss personal matters, but I'm here to offer a solution that could benefit everyone involved. My company is prepared to make a very generous offer for your father's ranch, generous enough to cover all outstanding debts and leave your family with substantial resources for the future." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document, placing it on the desk between them. These are the preliminary terms. I think you'll find them quite favorable, considering the current market conditions. Josie glanced at the papers but made no move to pick them up. And what exactly would your company want with a small cattle ranch that's struggling to remain profitable? We have plans for developing the entire valley, bringing modern conveniences and economic opportunities to what is currently an underutilized region. Your father's property, combined with several other ranches we're hoping to acquire, would be part of a much larger and more profitable enterprise. The explanation was delivered with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to persuading people to accept offers they might not initially find appealing. But Josie had grown up around ranch negotiations, and she recognized the signs of someone who was saying far less than the whole truth. And if we're not interested in selling? Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardness that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way regardless of other people's preferences. Miss Whitaker, I hope it won't come to that. Your father's medical bills are mounting, and I understand the ranch's financial situation is becoming increasingly precarious. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for people we care about is help them make realistic decisions about their future. The veiled threat was delivered so casually that for a moment Josie wasn't sure she had heard it correctly. But the implication was clear: enough accept the offer or face the consequences of continued financial pressure that would eventually force a sale anyway, likely under much less favorable terms. I think this conversation is over, Mr. Blackwood, she said, rising from her chair with as much dignity as she could manage. When and if my family decides to consider selling our ranch, we'll evaluate all legitimate offers through proper legal channels. Blackwood stood as well, his movements unhurried and confident. Of course, but I hope you'll discuss this with your father soon. These opportunities don't remain available indefinitely, and it would be unfortunate if delay resulted in a less favorable outcome for everyone involved. After he left, Josie sat alone in the office, staring at the documents he had left behind. The offer was indeed generous, far more than the ranch was worth in its current struggling condition. But the money came with conditions that would essentially erase everything her family had built, transforming their life's work into nothing more than raw material for someone else's development plans. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention, and she looked up to see Silas in the doorway, his expression immediately registering concern as he took in her obvious distress. "I saw Blackwood leaving," he said quietly. "Are you all right?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern rather than mere politeness, was nearly enough to break through the composure she had been struggling to maintain. For weeks now, she had been carrying the weight of her family's crisis largely alone, determined not to burden others with problems that weren't theirs to solve. But there was something about Silas's presence's quiet strength, his obvious concern for her welfare, that made the idea of sharing her burden seem not like weakness, but like a gift she might offer to someone who had proven himself worthy of her trust. "He wants to buy my father's ranch," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Made what he called a generous offer, though it came with implications about what might happen if we refuse." Silas's jaw tightened, and she saw a flash of something dangerous in his steel-grey eyes. "What kind of implications?" "Nothing specific enough to be called a direct threat. Just suggestions that my father's medical expenses might become overwhelming, that financial pressure has a way of forcing people to make decisions they might not otherwise consider." She gestured toward the papers Blackwood had left behind. "The offer is substantial. I'll give him that. More than enough to pay off all of Papa's medical bills and leave us comfortable for years to come. But it would mean giving up everything my family has worked to build. Everything that gives Papa's life meaning and purpose. He's been ranching that land for 30 years, and his father before him. It's not just property to use its home, it's history, it's who we are." Silas moved closer, his attention focused entirely on her face. "What do you want to do?" The question was asked without judgment, without any suggestion of what her answer should be. It was simply an acknowledgement that the choice was hers to make, and that whatever she decided would be respected and supported. "I want to fight," she said, the words coming out with more force than she had intended. "I want to find a way to save the ranch without compromising everything it represents to our family. But I'm not sure that's possible anymore." The admission felt like a betrayal of everything she had been raised to believe about perseverance and determination in the face of adversity. But it was also a recognition of reality, an acknowledgement that some problems couldn't be solved through sheer force of will. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful and assessing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality she had rarely heard from him, a warmth that suggested she was being offered something precious and rare. "Josie, there might be options you haven't considered yet. Would you be willing to let me look into this situation? Not as your employer, but as someone who cares about what happens to you and your family." The use of her first name, the open admission that his concern extended beyond professional courtesy, created a moment of intimacy that neither of them had quite anticipated. For several heartbeats, they simply looked at each other, both acutely aware that they were standing at the threshold of something that would change the fundamental nature of their relationship. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly. His answer, when it came, was delivered with a vulnerability that she had never seen from him before. "Because in 3 weeks, you've reminded me of things I thought I'd forgotten. Because your strength and courage deserve better than to be worn down by circumstances beyond your control. And because the idea of losing you, of having you forced away from here, is something I find I'm not prepared to accept." The declaration hung in the air between them, honest and unguarded, and filled with implications that would require careful consideration from both of them. But for now, it was enough to know that she wasn't facing this crisis alone, that someone she had come to respect and care for was willing to stand beside her in whatever battles lay ahead. Outside, thunder whinnied from his corral, the sound carrying across the afternoon air like a reminder that some things that seemed impossible could be achieved through patience, understanding, and the willingness to believe that trust could triumph over fear. For the first time since receiving the morning's devastating mail, Josie allowed herself to hope that her family's story might not be over after all. The leather-bound family Bible had belonged to Josie's grandmother, its pages worn soft from decades of faithful reading, and its margins filled with handwritten notes that chronicled 3 generations of hopes, fears, and quiet faith. Josie carried it with her when she made the Sunday journey to her father's ranch, a ritual that had become both comfort and torment as she watched him grow weaker with each passing week. Thomas Whitaker sat in his favorite chair on the front porch, wrapped in the quilt his late wife had made during their first winter together. At 68, he had once been a man of formidable strength and boundless energy, capable of working 18-hour days during calving season and still finding time to read bedtime stories to his only daughter. Now, the simple act of breathing seemed to require conscious effort, and his hands shook slightly as he reached for the glass of water Josie placed beside him. "You look tired, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying the wheeze that had become constant over the past month. "That job working you too hard?" Josie settled into the chair beside him, the Bible resting in her lap as she studied her father's beloved face. Even illness couldn't entirely erase the kindness in his brown eyes, or the gentle humor that had sustained their family through every hardship they had faced together. "The job's fine, Papa. Better than fine, actually. I think I've found something I could build a real future around." "That's good to hear. You deserve a place that appreciates what you can do, not just what you can't." The comment was delivered without self-pity, but it carried echoes of conversations they had shared throughout her childhood discussions about how to navigate a world that often judged people by their limitations rather than their capabilities. Thomas Whitaker had spent 20 years ensuring his daughter understood that her worth wasn't diminished by her physical challenges, that strength came in many forms, and that the right people would always see past surface differences to recognize genuine character. "Papa, I need to talk to you about something serious." Something in her tone caused him to shift in his chair, his attention focusing on her face with the intensity that had always made her feel like the most important person in his world. "Carson Blackwood came to see me again yesterday. He's made an offer for the ranch." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the land that had been his life's work, the pastures where his cattle grazed, the barn he had built with his own hands, the fence lines he had repaired countless times over the years. Every acre held memories, every building represented dreams he and his late wife had shared and sacrificed to achieve. "I suppose it's a generous offer," he said finally. "More than generous, enough to pay all your medical bills and leave us comfortable for years to come. But you don't want to take it." It wasn't a question. After 30 years of reading his daughter's expressions, Thomas Whitaker could recognize her internal struggles, even when she tried to hide them. "I don't want to take it," Josie confirmed, "but I'm not sure we have much choice anymore." She opened the Bible to a page marked with a ribbon, her fingers tracing the familiar verses that had provided guidance through every major decision of her adult life. The book represented more than religious faith. It was a connection to the women who had come before her, a reminder of the strength and wisdom that flowed through her family line. "Your mama used to say that the hardest decisions were the ones where both choices led to something that mattered," Thomas said quietly. "Save the ranch and watch the medical bills destroy us slowly, or sell the ranch and lose the thing that's given our lives meaning." The observation was delivered with the calm acceptance that had always characterized his approach to life's challenges. Thomas Whitaker had never been a man to rail against circumstances beyond his control, but he had also never been one to surrender without exploring every possible alternative. "There might be another option," Josie said carefully. "Someone who might be able to help us find a solution that doesn't require choosing between your health and our home." Her father's eyebrows rose slightly, but he waited for her to continue rather than pressing for details. "Silas Thorne has offered to look into our situation. He thinks there might be legal or financial approaches we haven't considered." "The man you work for? The one they call the Glacier?" Josie couldn't suppress a small smile at the nickname. Over the past month, she had discovered that Silas's reputation for cold isolation was largely a protective facade, a way of keeping the world at a safe distance while he dealt with his own grief and loss. Beneath the careful control, she had found someone capable of surprising warmth, unexpected humor, and a depth of caring that he seemed almost afraid to acknowledge. "He's not what people think he is, Papa. He's been hurt, and he's learned to protect himself by not letting anyone get too close. But he's a good man, and he's offered to help us for reasons that have nothing to do with business or obligation." Thomas studied his daughter's face with the careful attention that had allowed him to guide her through childhood and adolescence. What he saw there was something he had been hoping to witness for years, the particular glow that came when someone discovered they were genuinely cared for by another person. "You've grown fond of him," he said, the statement carrying no judgment, only gentle observation. "I think I have," Josie admitted. "More than fond, if I'm being honest with myself." "And how does he feel about you?" I think he's beginning to care about me too. But he's been widowed for 12 years, and I don't think he ever expected to feel anything like that again. It scares him." Thomas reached over and covered her hand with his own, his touch still carrying the warmth and strength that had been her anchor throughout her life. "Sweetheart, if this man is willing to help our family through a crisis that isn't his responsibility, and if he's doing it because he cares about your happiness, then I think he might be worth taking a chance on, even if it's frightening for both of you." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and they looked up to see 2 riders approaching the house. One was Carson Blackwood, his expression carrying the confident satisfaction of someone who believed he held all the advantages in an important negotiation. The other was a man Josie didn't recognize, though his expensive clothing and calculating manner suggested he represented the same interests as Blackwood. "Mr. Whitaker," Blackwood called out as he dismounted, his tone carrying false friendliness that didn't quite mask the underlying pressure. "I hope you've had time to consider our offer." I brought along my associate, Mr. Harrison, who handles the legal aspects of our acquisitions." Thomas Whitaker rose from his chair with careful dignity, his illness unable to diminish the natural authority that had made him a respected figure in the community for decades. "Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your interest in our property, but as I told you before, any decisions about the ranch will be made in consultation with my daughter and our legal counsel." Harrison stepped forward, a sheaf of papers in his hand, and an expression that suggested he was accustomed to cutting through what he considered unnecessary delays. "Mr. Whitaker, I understand your attachment to this property, but I think you need to consider the practical realities of your situation. Your medical expenses are mounting, your ranch operations are barely profitable, and market conditions aren't likely to improve in the foreseeable future." He gestured toward the papers he carried. "We're prepared to finalize this transaction today with payment arrangements that would address your immediate financial needs. Continuing to delay will only make your situation more difficult." Josie stood beside her father, her hand resting protectively on his arm as she faced the two men. "Gentlemen, I think my father has made our position clear. We're not prepared to make any decisions today." Blackwood's expression hardened, the veneer of friendliness finally dropping away to reveal something much less pleasant underneath. "Miss Whitaker, I hope you're not allowing sentiment to cloud your judgment about what's best for your family. Your father needs medical care that requires resources you simply don't have. Refusing our offer won't change that reality. What it will change," said a new voice from behind them, "is giving you the opportunity to continue pressuring people who are dealing with serious illness." They turned to see Silas Thorne approaching on horseback, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic of the confrontation. He dismounted with fluid grace, his attention focused entirely on Blackwood and Harrison, with an intensity that made both men unconsciously step backward. "Mr. Thorne," Blackwood said, his voice now carrying a note of uncertainty, "I didn't realize you had an interest in this property." "I have an interest in ensuring that the people of this valley are treated with the respect and consideration they deserve," Silas replied, his tone carrying the quiet authority that had built his empire, "which includes not being pressured into making major life decisions while they're dealing with medical crises." Harrison attempted to reassert control of the situation. "Sir, this is a private business matter between our company and the Whitaker family, and it will remain private until such time as the Whitakers choose to make it otherwise," Silas said firmly. "I suggest you gentlemen return to wherever you came from and allow this family to make their decisions without further interference." The confrontation might have escalated, but something in Silas's manner, a quality of controlled danger that suggested he was capable of backing up his words with action, convinced both men that retreat was the wiser course. After they left, Thomas Whitaker studied the man who had just defended his family's right to make their own choices without coercion. "Mr. Thorne, I believe I owe you my thanks." "No thanks necessary, sir. I don't care for people who try to take advantage of others' difficulties." As the three of them stood together on the porch, watching the dust settle from Blackwood's departure, Josie felt something shift in her understanding of what the future might hold. For the first time since her father's diagnosis, she allowed herself to believe that their story might not end with loss and defeat after all. The family Bible remained in her lap, its familiar weight, a reminder that faith sometimes required the courage to accept help when it was offered. Even when accepting that help meant acknowledging that some battles were too important to fight alone. The hidden document lay in the bottom drawer of Silas's private safe, beneath layers of other papers that chronicled decades of careful business decisions and strategic land acquisitions. Josie discovered it entirely by accident while helping him organize financial records related to her family's situation, her eyes catching sight of official seals and legal language that seemed oddly familiar. "Silas," she said quietly, holding up the document that had been filed away and apparently forgotten. "What is this?" He looked up from the correspondence he had been reviewing, his expression immediately changing as he recognized what she held in her hands. For a moment, something like panic flashed across his features, the look of a man who had been caught in an act he wasn't prepared to explain. It's an old business document, nothing that concerns our current situation. But Josie had grown up around legal papers, had spent enough time helping her father navigate ranch business to recognize the significance of what she was reading. The document was a comprehensive mineral rights deed, covering not just Thorn Ridge Ranch, but vast expanses of the surrounding valley, including, she realized with growing amazement, her father's property. Silas, this says you own the mineral rights to half the valley, including our ranch. The date on this is from 13 years ago, just after. She stopped, the implications beginning to dawn on her. Just after Margaret died, he finished quietly, his voice carrying a weight she had never heard from him before. You bought these rights when you were grieving, when you weren't thinking clearly about business decisions. No. Silas stood and moved to the window, his back turned to her as he stared out at the land that had become both his empire and his prison. I bought them because I was thinking very clearly, more clearly than I had about anything since Margaret's funeral. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications that neither of them had anticipated when they began this investigation into her family's financial crisis. Josie set the document on his desk and waited, sensing that there was much more to this story than she had yet heard. After Margaret died, I went through a period where I couldn't bear the thought of anyone else in this valley suffering the way I had suffered, Silas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I knew that economic hardship could destroy families, could take away everything that gave people's lives meaning. So I started buying mineral rights. He turned back to face her, his steel-gray eyes, reflecting a vulnerability she had never seen before. The idea was that if hard times came, drought, market crashes, medical emergencies, I could offer to purchase mineral extraction rights at prices that would allow families to keep their land while solving their immediate financial problems. It was supposed to be a safety net, a way of protecting the community without making people feel like they were accepting charity. Josie stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was telling her. You've been secretly protecting every ranch family in this valley for over a decade. Not secretly, privately. There's a difference. Silas returned to his desk, his movements carrying the weight of someone who had been carrying a significant burden for a very long time. The problem is that using this solution requires revealing that I own these rights, which means explaining why I bought them, which means people would know that the glacier isn't actually cold at all, Josie finished, beginning to understand the complexity of his situation. People need me to be distant and unapproachable. It allows them to maintain their dignity when they accept my business offers, my employment opportunities, my assistance with community projects. If they knew I was motivated by sentiment rather than profit, it would change everything. The revelation recontextualized everything Josie thought she knew about Silas Thorne and his relationship with the surrounding community. His reputation for cold calculation wasn't just a defensive mechanism to protect his own heart. It was also a carefully constructed facade that allowed him to help others without compromising their pride or independence. But surely people would understand. Would they? Silas interrupted gently. Would your father accept help from someone he knew was motivated by pity? Would the other ranchers in this valley continue to deal with me as an equal if they knew I saw them as objects of charity rather than respected business partners? Josie was forced to acknowledge the truth of his observation. Her father's pride, his determination to stand on his own merits, his insistence that any help he accepted be earned, rather than given all of these qualities that she admired in him, would indeed make it difficult for him to accept assistance that he perceived as charity. So you've been helping people for 13 years while allowing them to believe you were simply a shrewd businessman. It was the only way I could figure out how to honor Margaret's memory while respecting everyone else's dignity, Silas said. She would have wanted me to take care of people, but she also would have understood that taking care of people sometimes means letting them believe they're taking care of themselves. The moral complexity of his position was staggering. For over a decade, he had been quietly ensuring the economic stability of an entire community while accepting a reputation for coldness and calculation that must have been deeply painful to maintain. Every time someone called him the Glacier, every time people spoke of him with fear rather than affection, he had been forced to accept that judgment as the price of helping others without compromising their self-respect. "The mineral rights to our ranch," Josie said slowly. "You could solve our financial crisis immediately." "Yes. The coal and copper deposits on your father's land are worth enough to pay his medical bills 10 times over, with enough left to modernize his entire operation. But revealing that would expose everything you've been trying to protect." "Yes." They sat in silence for several minutes, both grappling with the implications of what had been revealed. The solution to her family's crisis was literally within reach, but accepting it would require Silas to sacrifice something he had spent 13 years building, a carefully constructed identity that allowed him to be the person Margaret would have wanted him to be, without admitting to the sentimentality that might diminish his effectiveness as a protector and provider. "There has to be another way," Josie said finally. "Some approach that solves our immediate problem without destroying what you've built here." Silas looked at her with an expression that combined gratitude, affection, and something that might have been hope. "Actually, there might be, but it would require you to trust me with something that goes far beyond business arrangements." "What do you mean?" "I mean that there's a way to transfer the mineral rights to your family that would look like a standard business transaction rather than an act of charity, but it would require us to formalize our relationship in a way that would make such a transfer seem natural and appropriate." The suggestion hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond the immediate financial crisis. Josie understood that he was talking about Maria Jeannot as a romantic gesture, but as a practical solution that would allow him to help her family while maintaining the facade that had protected his ability to help others. But even as she recognized the practical wisdom of his proposal, she found herself wanting something more than a marriage of convenience. Over the past month, she had discovered feelings for Silas that went far beyond gratitude or professional respect. The idea of marrying him to solve her family's financial problems felt like a betrayal of those deeper emotions, a reduction of something precious to mere business arrangement. "Silas," she said carefully, "if we were to marry, it would have to be for the right reasons. Not just because it would solve a practical problem, but because we truly want to build a life together." His response, when it came, was delivered with a vulnerability that took her breath away. "Josie, I stopped believing I would ever want to build a life with anyone after Margaret died. But these past weeks with you have reminded me of things I thought I'd lost forever. If I'm suggesting marriage, it's not just because it would solve your family's crisis. It's because the idea of spending the rest of my life without you has become something I can't bear to contemplate." The declaration transformed everything, shifting their conversation from practical problem-solving to something much more personal and profound. Here was the man behind the Glacier, admitting that he had found his way back to the possibility of love after more than a decade of convinced solitude. "Are you proposing to me, Silas Thorne? I'm asking if you would consider the possibility that two people who have both learned to be strong alone might be even stronger together." Outside, thunder whinnied from his corral, the sound carrying across the afternoon air like a reminder that the most remarkable transformations often came from patience, understanding, and the courage to trust in possibilities that others might dismiss as impossible. Looking into Silas's steel-gray eyes, Josie realized that she was being offered not just a solution to her family's immediate crisis, but a chance to build something lasting with a man whose depth of character and capacity for love had been hidden behind a reputation that protected others as much as it protected himself. For the first time in weeks, the future seemed to hold promise rather than merely the hope of avoiding disaster. The revolver had belonged to Silas's father, a Colt .45, with a worn grip and a weight that spoke of both protection and responsibility. For 23 years, it had rested in the locked drawer of his desk, cleaned and maintained but rarely drawn. a symbol of the frontier justice that had once been necessary, but was now largely relegated to memory. This morning, however, as Silas prepared for what might be the most important confrontation of his adult life, he found himself checking the weapon's action with the careful attention of a man who understood that some battles could not be won through words alone. The telegram had arrived at dawn, brought by a rider whose urgency suggested news that could not wait for regular mail delivery. The message was brief but alarming. Carson Blackwood and his associates were planning to file legal challenges against several ranch properties in the valley, claiming irregularities in original land grants that would force immediate sales to settle disputed ownership claims. It was a sophisticated legal maneuver that could bypass individual consent and force the community-wide land transfer that Blackwood's development company had been seeking. Worse, the telegram suggested that the legal action would begin with Thomas Whitaker's ranch, using his medical crisis and mounting debts as evidence that he was no longer capable of maintaining clear title to his property. The attack was both personal and strategic, designed to destroy Josie's family while establishing precedent for similar actions against other vulnerable ranchers. Buck Morrison knocked and entered the study without waiting for permission, his weathered face reflecting the same grim determination that had characterized his service to Thorn Ridge Ranch for over a decade. "Got word from town, Mr. Thorne. Blackwood's brought in lawyers from back east, men who specialize in what they call expedited land acquisition. They've set up temporary offices above the saloon, and they're planning some kind of public meeting for this afternoon." Silas holstered the revolver beneath his jacket, a precaution he hoped would prove unnecessary, but refused to ignore. In his experience, men who threatened families and communities were often prepared to escalate their tactics when their initial approaches proved unsuccessful. "What kind of meeting?" "Official presentation of their development plans, according to the notices they've been posting around town. But word is they're also planning to announce legal proceedings against anyone who's been uncooperative with their purchase offers." The strategy was as bold as it was ruthless, using public pressure and legal intimidation to force compliance from people who had already made clear their preference to keep their land. It was the kind of corporate expansion that treated individual lives and family legacies as obstacles to be overcome, rather than values to be respected. "Have you spoken with Miss Whitaker this morning?" "She's with her father, sir. Rode out before dawn to break the news about what might be coming. I suspect she's also telling him about your proposal." The reminder of his conversation with Josie the previous evening brought a complex mixture of emotions that Silas was still learning to navigate. Her acceptance of his marriage proposal had been everything he could have hoped, for genuine affection combined with practical wisdom, the promise of partnership built on mutual respect rather than mere convenience. But the joy of that acceptance was tempered by the knowledge that their happiness was under immediate threat from forces that cared nothing for individual dreams or community stability. "Buck, I want you to gather the men and meet me in town at 2 o'clock. All of them even, the ones who might prefer to avoid confrontation." "You planning to make this a public discussion, sir?" "I'm planning to make sure Blackwood understands that this valley has people in it who won't be intimidated into giving up everything they've worked to build." Buck nodded, his expression reflecting both approval and concern. "Might be wise to let folks know what you're really planning to do with those mineral rights you've been sitting on all these years." The suggestion was delivered carefully, but it carried implications that went to the heart of Silas's dilemma. For 13 years, he had maintained his effectiveness as a community protector by keeping his true motivations hidden. But the current crisis might require him to sacrifice that careful anonymity in order to provide the legal and financial ammunition necessary to defeat Blackwood's assault on the valley's families. "That decision isn't mine alone anymore," Silas said quietly. "I've asked Josie to marry me, which means her father's welfare becomes my direct responsibility. But revealing the mineral rights ownership affects every family in this valley, not just ours. Sir, with respect, I think those families would rather know they have a protector than continue believing they're facing this alone." Buck's observation carried the weight of practical wisdom earned through years of watching the community struggle with challenges that Silas could have solved with a word if that word hadn't risked undermining the very independence and dignity he was trying to preserve. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window, where they could see Josie returning from her father's ranch at a pace that suggested both urgency and determination. Even from a distance, her posture conveyed the resolution of someone who had made difficult decisions and was prepared to act on them regardless of personal cost. She dismounted near the main house and approached with purposeful strides, her expression carrying a mixture of grief and fierce determination that immediately put Silas on alert. Whatever conversation she had shared with her father that morning had clearly been both emotionally difficult and strategically important. "Silas," she said without preamble as she entered the study, "Papa wants to meet with you before this afternoon's confrontation. He has some things to say about our situation that he believes you need to hear." "How is he handling the news about Blackwood's legal threats?" "Better than I expected, actually. He said he's been expecting something like this ever since the first offers started coming. But he also said he's tired of letting other people make decisions about his family's future without fighting back." The comment suggested that Thomas Whitaker, despite his failing health, retained the fighting spirit that had sustained him through decades of frontier life. It also implied that he might be prepared to take risks that a younger, healthier man might avoid. "Josie, there's something else we need to discuss before we face whatever's coming this afternoon." Silas moved to his desk and withdrew a document he had been drafting since dawn. "I've been thinking about the best way to handle the mineral rights revelation, and I believe there's an approach that might preserve both your family's independence and the community's dignity." She took the papers he offered, her eyes scanning the legal language with the careful attention she had learned from years of helping her father with ranch business. "You're proposing to create a community trust," she said slowly, "with representatives from each ranch family having voting rights on mineral extraction decisions. The mineral rights remain in my name, but their use becomes subject to community oversight. It allows me to help families like yours without making them feel like they're accepting charity, because they become partners in the decision-making process rather than beneficiaries of my assistance." The proposal was elegant in its complexity, providing financial solutions while preserving the independence and dignity that Silas had spent 13 years trying to protect. But it also required a level of trust and cooperation from the community that could only be achieved if his true motivations were finally revealed and accepted. "It's brilliant," Josie said quietly, "but it means giving up the protection that the Glacier reputation has provided you all these years." "I've been thinking about that too, and I've realized that some protections become prisons if you maintain them too long. Margaret would have wanted me to help people, but she also would have wanted me to be honest about who I am and what I care about." The reference to his late wife was delivered without the pain that had characterized such mentions for over a decade. Instead, there was a sense of peace, of someone who had finally found a way to honor the past while embracing the possibility of a different future. "There's one more thing," Silas said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "This approach only works if the community accepts me as someone they can trust with this kind of responsibility. Given my reputation, that's not necessarily a foregone conclusion." Josie moved closer, her hand finding his with the natural ease that had characterized their growing intimacy over the past weeks. "Silas, there isn't a person in this valley who hasn't benefited from your fairness, your reliability, or your willingness to provide employment and business opportunities. They may call you the Glacier, but they also respect you. When they learn that you've been protecting them all these years, I think they'll understand that your distance was about protecting them, not dismissing them." As they prepared to leave for town and the confrontation that would determine the future of their community, Silas reflected on how completely his life had changed since Josie's arrival 6 weeks ago. Then, he had been a man convinced that isolation was the price of effectiveness, that emotional distance was necessary for practical assistance. Now, he was preparing to risk everything he had built on the belief that genuine partnership, both personal and community-wide, might accomplish more than solitary protection ever could. The revolver remained concealed beneath his jacket, a reminder that some conflicts required the willingness to fight. But as they walked toward their horses and the uncertain future that awaited them in town, Silas found himself believing that the most important battles might be won through courage, honesty, and the strength that came from people who refused to face their challenges alone. For the first time in 13 years, the glacier was ready to melt, trusting that what emerged would be strong enough to protect everything and everyone he had learned to love. The town hall had never held so many people at one time, the small buildings straining to accommodate ranchers, townspeople, and merchants who had come to hear Carson Blackwood's presentation and to witness what many sensed would be a pivotal moment in their valley's history. The air was thick with tension and the mingled scents of leather, wool, and the nervous perspiration of people who understood that their livelihoods were being threatened by forces beyond their individual control. Blackwood stood at the front of the room beside a portable easel displaying maps and development plans, his expensive Eastern clothing and confident bearing marking him as an outsider despite his months of cultivation within the community. Beside him stood Harrison and two other men in matching dark suits, their presence lending an air of legal authority to what might otherwise have seemed like simple business speculation. Thomas Whitaker sat in the front row, his illness evident in his pale complexion and labored breathing, but his presence itself a statement of defiance that resonated throughout the assembled crowd. Despite his failing health, he had insisted on attending, declaring that no one would make decisions about his family's future without his participation in the discussion. Josie sat beside her father, her hand resting protectively on his arm, while her green eyes remained fixed on Blackwood with an intensity that suggested she was prepared for whatever confrontation might develop. She wore her best dress, a simple but elegant garment that spoke of careful economy while maintaining the dignity appropriate for such a significant occasion. Silas entered the hall precisely at 2 o'clock, followed by Buck Morrison and the entire crew from Thorn Ridge Ranch. Their presence immediately shifted the room's atmosphere, the assembled community recognizing that the valley's most powerful landowner had chosen to make this a public rather than private matter. Conversations quieted as Silas moved through the crowd, his steel-gray eyes surveying the room with the careful attention of someone assessing both allies and potential threats. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to addressing groups and swaying opinions. "Thank you for coming today to hear about an opportunity that could transform this entire valley into something prosperous and modern." He gestured toward the maps behind him, which showed the existing ranch boundaries, overlaid with plans for railroad development, mining operations, and the construction of what appeared to be a substantial town where currently only scattered homesteads existed. The Consolidated Western Development Company represents Eastern investors who recognize the untapped potential of this region. With proper capitalization and modern management techniques, this valley could support 10 times its current population while providing economic opportunities that extend far beyond the limitations of individual ranching operations. The presentation was polished and persuasive, filled with promises of jobs, infrastructure improvements, and financial security for families who had spent generations struggling with the uncertainties of frontier agriculture. But it was also built on the assumption that the current residents would willingly surrender their independence in exchange for employment within someone else's vision of progress. "Of course," Blackwood continued, "such development requires the consolidation of existing landholdings into more efficient management units, which is why the company is prepared to offer generous compensation to current landowners who are willing to become partners in this transformation." "And what about those who aren't willing?" called out a voice from the back of the room. Blackwood's smile tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure as he addressed the challenge. "Naturally, we hope that reasonable people will recognize the benefits of voluntary cooperation. However, our legal research has identified certain irregularities in some of the original land grants that may require judicial resolution. Harrison stepped forward, his manner suggesting that he had been waiting for this moment to demonstrate his expertise. Several properties in this valley were granted under territorial statutes that contained provisions requiring continuous improvement and development. Failure to meet those requirements could result in title reversion to territorial authority, which would then allow for proper redistribution under current legal frameworks. The legal threat was delivered with bureaucratic language designed to obscure its essential meaning, but the message was clear enough. Families who refused to sell would face court challenges that could result in the loss of their land without compensation. "That's a fancy way of saying you'll steal our ranches through legal manipulation," said a rancher named Pete Jameson, his voice carrying the anger that was building throughout the room. "Mr. Jameson, we're simply ensuring that all landholdings in this valley have clear and undisputable title," Harrison replied smoothly. "Any irregularities that emerge during that process will be resolved through proper legal channels. Starting with the Whitaker Ranch," Blackwood added, his attention turning to Thomas Whitaker with predatory focus. "Mr. Whitaker's medical expenses and operational difficulties make his property an ideal test case for the title verification process." The direct threat against one of the community's most respected families created a murmur of outrage throughout the room, but before anyone could respond, Silas Thorne rose from his seat near the back of the hall. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying easily across the crowded room, "I think there are some aspects of the local situation that you may not have fully understood." All attention shifted to Silas as he moved forward through the crowd, his presence immediately commanding the kind of respect that came from years of fair dealing and community leadership. Blackwood's confident expression flickered slightly, suggesting that he had not expected direct opposition from the valley's most powerful landowner. "Mr. Thorne, I'm surprised to see you here," Blackwood said, attempting to regain control of the presentation. "I would have thought someone of your business acumen would appreciate the opportunities we're offering." "Oh, I appreciate opportunities," Silas replied, his tone carrying a note of quiet danger that made several people in the room shift nervously. "But I'm particular about distinguishing between genuine opportunities and elaborate theft disguised as legal procedure." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, transforming what had been a business presentation into something approaching a formal confrontation. Harrison stepped forward, clearly intending to assert legal authority over what he perceived as emotional outburst. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you not to make unfounded accusations about legitimate legal processes. There's nothing legitimate about threatening families with fraudulent title challenges." Silas interrupted, his steel-grey eyes fixed on Harrison with unmistakable intensity. "And there's nothing legal about using medical emergencies as leverage to force land sales." Josie rose from her seat beside her father, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the assembled crowd. "Everyone in this room should understand exactly what these men are proposing. They want to take our ranches, our homes, and our way of life, and replace them with mining operations and railroad construction that will benefit investors in distant cities while leaving us with nothing." "Miss Whitaker," Blackwood said, his earlier pretense of friendliness now completely abandoned, "I think your family's financial difficulties may be affecting your judgment about what's realistic and what's merely sentimental." The dismissive comment was a mistake, immediately galvanizing the room's sympathy toward Josie and her father, while revealing the contempt that Blackwood felt for the people he was attempting to manipulate. "Mr. Blackwood," Thomas Whitaker said, his voice weak but carrying absolute authority, "my family has been ranching this land for 30 years. We've survived drought, blizzards, market crashes, and Indian raids. We've built something here that has value beyond any price you could offer. Mr. Whitaker, with respect, sentiment doesn't pay medical bills." "No," Silas said, stepping forward until he was directly facing Blackwood across the small space at the front of the room. "But mineral rights do." The statement created absolute silence throughout the hall, every person present recognizing that something significant was about to be revealed. Blackwood's expression shifted from confidence to confusion, then to alarm as he began to understand that his carefully planned presentation was about to be derailed by information he had not anticipated. 13 years ago, Silas continued, his voice now addressing the entire community rather than just Blackwood, I purchased mineral rights to most of the land in this valley. Coal, copper, silver enough to make every family here wealthy if they choose to extract it, or secure enough to never worry about medical bills or mortgage payments if they prefer to lease the rights to others. The revelation created a wave of murmuring throughout the room as people began to understand the implications of what they were hearing. Blackwood's face had gone pale, his entire strategy suddenly undermined by the discovery that the land he was trying to acquire through intimidation was already encumbered by existing rights that could provide exactly the financial security he had been claiming only his company could offer. Ladies and gentlemen, Silas said, turning to address the assembled community, I'm proposing to transfer these mineral rights to a community trust that would give every ranch family voting control over how these resources are used. No outside company, no Eastern investors, no legal manipulations, just neighbors working together to ensure that everyone in this valley has the security and independence they deserve. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. The fear and anger that had characterized the early part of the meeting giving way to something approaching celebration as people began to understand that they were not as vulnerable as they had believed. But Blackwood was not finished, and his response revealed the true nature of the forces he represented. Mr. Thorne, Blackwood said, his voice now carrying an edge of desperation that had been entirely absent from his earlier confident presentation. I think you may be making promises you're not legally authorized to fulfill. Mineral rights transfers require extensive documentation and regulatory approval that could take years to complete. Harrison stepped forward, clearly attempting to reassert some semblance of legal authority over proceedings that had spiraled far beyond their original script. Furthermore, existing mineral rights don't negate the title irregularities we've identified. Those are separate legal issues that must be resolved regardless of any subsurface ownership claims. But Silas had anticipated this line of attack, and his response demonstrated the thorough preparation that had characterized his approach to every significant business decision over the past 2 decades. Actually, Mr. Harrison, I think you'll find that the mineral rights documentation is quite current and comprehensive, he said, withdrawing a leather portfolio from his jacket. Filed with territorial authorities, registered with federal mining oversight, and cross-referenced with every property survey conducted in this valley over the past 15 years. He handed the documents to Buck Morrison, who began distributing copies to interested community members. As for the title irregularities you mentioned, I've taken the liberty of having every land grant in this valley reviewed by legal counsel in Denver. Turns out that the improvements and development requirements have been met by every ranch family here, often exceeded by substantial margins. The systematic dismantling of Blackwood's legal strategy was accomplished with the kind of methodical precision that had built Silas's business empire, but it was motivated by something far more personal than mere commercial competition. Every document, every legal precedent, every procedural safeguard had been researched and prepared with the specific goal of protecting the families and community that had become precious to him in ways he was only beginning to fully understand. Josie watched the proceedings with growing admiration for the man she had agreed to marry, seeing displayed before the entire community the depth of caring and protective instinct that he had hidden behind his reputation as the Glacier. This was not just business, acumen, or strategic thinking. This was love in proscent grief. Action, the willingness to risk everything to defend what mattered most. Mr. Thorne, Blackwood said, his earlier composure now completely abandoned in favor of barely controlled anger. You seem to have put considerable effort into interfering with legitimate business development. I hope you understand that consolidated Western represents interests with substantial resources and legal reach that extend far beyond this isolated valley. The threat was no longer veiled, and its implications were clear to everyone in the room. But instead of intimidating Silas, it seemed to awaken something in him that had been dormant for years, a willingness to fight openly for what he believed in, rather than limiting himself to quiet, anonymous protection. "Mr. Blackwood, are you threatening me? I'm simply pointing out that sometimes local situations become subject to broader economic and political forces that individuals can't control, regardless of their good intentions." Silas unbuttoned his jacket slightly, the movement subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with frontier protocols for armed confrontation. The gesture was not aggressive, but it was absolutely clear in its implication she was prepared to defend himself and his community against any threat, whether legal, economic, or physical. "Let me make something clear to you and your associates," Silas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him one of the most respected figures in the territory. "This valley is home to families who have earned their place here through decades of hard work, sacrifice, and mutual support. They don't need salvation from Eastern investors, and they don't need to be rescued from their own supposedly poor judgment." He turned to address the assembled community, his steel-grey eyes reflecting a warmth that few of them had ever seen from the man they had called the Glacier. "For 13 years I've been trying to find ways to help this community while respecting everyone's independence and dignity. I bought those mineral rights because I wanted to make sure that if hard times came, families would have options that didn't require giving up everything they'd worked to build." Thomas Whitaker struggled to his feet, his illness evident, but his determination unmistakable as he faced Blackwood and his associates. "Mr. Blackwood, you came here thinking you could take advantage of an old man's medical bills and a community's economic struggles. What you found instead is a place where people take care of each other, where a man like Silas Thorne spends 13 years quietly ensuring that his neighbors never have to face their problems alone." The old rancher's voice grew stronger as he continued, drawing on reserves of strength that his illness hadn't been able to diminish. "You want to buy my ranch? Then you'll have to outbid the mineral rights income that Mr. Thorne's generosity has just made available to my family. You want to challenge my land title? Then you'll have to prove your case against legal documentation that one of the territory's most successful businessmen has already verified." Josie moved to stand beside her father, her hand resting on his arm in support. But her attention focused entirely on Blackwood as she delivered what amounted to a final rejection of everything his company represented. "Mr. Blackwood, when you first approached our family, you assumed that our difficulties made us vulnerable to exploitation. What you didn't understand is that our difficulties also made us capable of recognizing genuine help when it was offered." She turned to look at Silas, her green eyes reflecting the depth of feeling that had grown between them over the past weeks. "This man could have solved our financial problems with a simple business transaction, but he chose instead to find a solution that preserved our dignity and strengthened our entire community. That's the difference between someone who sees people as opportunities and someone who sees them as family." The emotional declaration created a moment of absolute silence in the crowded hall, followed by something that no one present would ever forget: spontaneous applause that began with Pete Jameson and spread throughout the room until even Blackwood's associates seemed to recognize that they were witnessing something remarkable. When the applause finally died down, Silas stepped forward and extended his hand to Josie in a gesture that was both intimate and public, personal and community-wide in its significance. "Miss Whitaker," he said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent room, "I believe I asked you a question yesterday that deserves a public answer." Josie took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his as she faced the assembled community that had become witness to both their individual struggles and their growing love. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice clear and strong and filled with joy, "the answer is yes. Yes to your proposal. yes to the life we could build together, and yes to being part of a community where people choose to take care of each other instead of taking advantage of each other. The second wave of applause was even more enthusiastic than the first, transforming what had begun as a business confrontation into something approaching a celebration. Buck Morrison actually whistled, several of the ranch hands cheered outright, and even some of the more reserved townspeople found themselves smiling at the unexpected romance that had emerged from what could have been their community's darkest hour. Blackwood and his associates made their exit during the celebration, their departure largely unnoticed by people who had discovered they had much more important things to think about than the failed schemes of would-be exploiters. The threat they had represented was real, but it had been defeated not through violence or legal manipulation, but through the simple power of a community that refused to allow fear to override their commitment to each other. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Silas and Josie with congratulations, expressions of gratitude, and the kind of warm acceptance that had been offered to the Glacier, in name only but was now being extended to Silas Thorne, the man-protector, neighbor, and soon-to-be husband, to the woman who had helped him remember that strength shared was always more powerful than strength hoarded. The ring he slipped onto Josie's finger was a simple gold band, newly purchased but somehow perfect in its understated elegance. It represented not just their engagement, but the promise of a future built on partnership, community, and the kind of love that grew stronger when it was shared, rather than hidden away behind protective walls of ice and isolation. For the first time in 13 years, the man once known as the Glacier allowed himself to believe that warmth and vulnerability might be sources of strength rather than dangerous weaknesses to be avoided at all costs. 6 months later, the sign at the entrance to what had once been known simply as Thorn Ridge Ranch had been replaced with hand-carved lettering that read Thorn Whitaker Ranch, the hyphenated name representing not just the union of two properties, but the merger of two hearts that had found their way to each other through circumstances neither could have anticipated or planned. The wedding had taken place on a crisp October morning, with the entire valley community gathered in the meadow behind the main house where Margaret Thorne's garden had once flourished and where Josie was now coaxing new life from soil that had lain fallow for over a decade. Thomas Whitaker had walked his daughter down the aisle, despite his continuing health challenges, his strength sustained by the joy of seeing her happiness and the security that came from knowing she would be cherished by a man who understood the true value of the love he was receiving. Pastor Williams had conducted the ceremony with the kind of warmth that came from officiating at a wedding the entire community had been anticipating since that remarkable day in the town hall when private feelings had become public declarations. Buck Morrison had served as best man, his weathered face reflecting years of loyalty to Silas and genuine affection for the woman who had accomplished what no one else had been able to achieve, melting the ice around his employer's heart without diminishing the strength that lay beneath. The reception had lasted well into the evening, with neighbors contributing food, music, and the kind of spontaneous celebration that marked significant moments in small communities where individual happiness was understood to be inseparable from collective well-being. Even Thunder had participated in his own way, standing regally in his corral and accepting the admiration of wedding guests who marveled at the transformation of what had once been the ranch's most dangerous animal into a mount so gentle that children could approach him without fear. Now, as winter approached and the first snow of the season dusted the mountain peaks visible from their bedroom window, Josie and Silas were discovering the rhythms of married life, with the kind of contentment that came from partnership built on genuine compatibility rather than mere convenience or passion. The Mineral Rights Trust had been established exactly as Silas had promised, with representatives from each ranch family participating in decisions about resource extraction and profit distribution. The first quarterly payments had been substantial enough to address every family's immediate financial concerns, while establishing a foundation for long-term economic security that would benefit the entire valley for generations to come. Thomas Whitaker's health had stabilized with the reduction in stress that came from financial security and the knowledge that his daughter's future was assured. The new treatments made possible by adequate medical insurance had slowed the progression of his heart condition, and while he would never again be the vigorous man he had once been, he was able to enjoy his remaining years with dignity and the satisfaction of seeing his life's work continued by people who understood its value. Carson Blackwood and his associates had never returned to the valley, their attention apparently redirected toward communities less capable of unified resistance to outside exploitation. The legal challenges they had threatened had evaporated once it became clear that their targets possessed both the resources and the determination necessary for prolonged court battles, along with legal representation that matched anything corporate interests could provide. But perhaps the most significant change was the transformation that had occurred in Silas himself. The man who had once been known as the Glacier now moved through his daily life with a warmth and openness that had been missing for so long that even he had forgotten it was possible. His smile came easily, his laughter was frequent, and his interactions with ranch hands, neighbors, and townspeople carried the genuine affection of someone who had rediscovered the joy of human connection. This morning, as he watched Josie work with a new group of young horses that had arrived the previous week, Silas reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. Her skill with difficult animals continued to astonish him, but he had come to understand that her gift extended far beyond horse training to encompass a rare ability to see potential where others saw only problems, to offer patience where others provided only judgment, and to extend trust where others maintained defensive distance. She moved through the corral with the same graceful efficiency that had first caught his attention. Her slight limp now, nothing more than part of the natural rhythm that made her one with the animals she trained. The young horses responded to her voice and presence with the kind of immediate acceptance that had once seemed magical, but which he now recognized as the result of genuine understanding, careful observation, and the willingness to meet each individual creature exactly where they were, rather than where she thought they should be. "Admiring your wife's work?" Buck Morrison asked, approaching with the kind of casual familiarity that had developed between them since Silas had abandoned the emotional distance that had once characterized all his relationships. "Among other things," Silas replied, his tone carrying the contentment of a man who had found his place in the world after years of searching for it in all the wrong directions. "She's got that bay gelding eating out of her hand already, and he was trying to kick down the corral fence when he arrived yesterday. She has a way of convincing difficult creatures that cooperation is more rewarding than resistance," Silas observed, the comment applying to more than just horses. Buck chuckled, understanding the broader implications of his employer's words. "Worked on you, didn't it?" The good-natured teasing was something that would have been unthinkable during the years when Silas's reputation for cold isolation had made such familiarity seem both impossible and inadvisable. Now, it was simply part of the easy camaraderie that had developed among people who had learned to value honesty over careful diplomacy. "She did indeed," Silas admitted without embarrassment. "Turned out I wasn't nearly as frozen as I thought I was." As they watched, Josie successfully placed a halter on the bay gelding, an accomplishment that would normally have taken several days of patient work, but which she had achieved in less than 24 hours. The horse stood calmly beside her, his earlier agitation replaced by alert trust, his ears forward and his posture relaxed. "Another satisfied customer," Buck observed with satisfaction. "She's building quite a reputation. Had an inquiry yesterday from a rancher up in Montana who heard about her methods and wants to send down some horses that have been giving his people trouble." The business possibilities were significant, representing the potential for Josie to develop her skills into something approaching a regional specialty that could benefit not just their own ranch, but horse owners throughout the territory. But more important than the financial opportunities was the recognition that her talents were finally receiving the respect and appreciation they deserved. "Evening, gentlemen," Josie called out as she approached, having finished her work with the young horses for the day. Enjoying the supervisory roles? Just appreciating expert craftsmanship, Silas replied, moving to take her in his arms with the natural ease that had characterized their physical relationship from its earliest days. That bay gelding is going to be one of your finest successes, Buck predicted. Remind me never to doubt your assessment of which animals are worth the extra effort. As Buck departed for his own evening routines, Silas and Josie stood together in the gathering dusk, watching the lights begin to appear in ranch house windows across the valley, where families were settling into their own evening rituals of comfort and connection. "Do you ever miss it?" Josie asked quietly, her voice carrying the kind of intimate curiosity that came from genuine caring rather than mere nosiness. "Miss what?" "Being the Glacier, having that reputation for being untouchable and completely self-sufficient." Silas considered the question seriously, recognizing that it went to the heart of the transformation he had undergone over the past year. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it," he admitted. "When you don't let yourself care about anyone, you don't have to worry about their happiness or safety or future. When you don't allow yourself to love, you don't have to risk losing what you love." He paused, his arms tightening around her as he continued. "But I don't miss the loneliness, the sense that nothing I accomplished really mattered beyond the immediate practical benefits. And I certainly don't miss the feeling that my life was over at 30, that the best parts of being human were things I could only remember rather than experience." "No regrets, then?" "Only one," Silas said, his voice carrying a note of gentle humor. "I regret that it took me so long to understand that the strongest walls are often the ones that keep out exactly what we need most." As they walked toward the main house where dinner waited, and the evening stretched ahead of them, with the comfortable promise of shared conversation, shared silence, and shared dreams for the future, Josie reflected on the remarkable transformation she had witnessed in the man beside her. The change wasn't just personal, it had rippled throughout the entire community, creating a network of mutual support and cooperation that made everyone stronger while preserving the independence and dignity that frontier life demanded. The Mineral Rights Trust was functioning exactly as intended, providing security without creating dependency, offering assistance without compromising self-respect. "Silas," she said as they reached the front porch where Thomas Whitaker sat in his favorite chair, wrapped in his quilt and reading by the light of a kerosene lamp, "I have something to tell you." The serious tone of her voice immediately captured his attention, and he turned to face her with the kind of focused concern that had become second nature since their marriage. "The doctor in Cheyenne confirmed what I suspected. We're going to have a baby." The news created a moment of absolute stillness as Silas absorbed the implications of what she had just told him. Then his face transformed with a joy so complete and overwhelming that it seemed to illuminate the gathering darkness around them. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder and delight, and the kind of anticipation that he had never allowed himself to imagine possible again. "Due next summer, if Dr. Patterson's calculations are correct." Thomas Whitaker looked up from his reading, his weathered face creasing into a smile that reflected both grandfatherly pride and deep satisfaction at the continuation of his family line. "Well," the old rancher said with the dry humor that had sustained him through every challenge life had presented, "looks like that new sign at the ranch entrance is going to need some additions in a few years." As they settled onto the porch to watch the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky, Silas reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought him from isolation to this moment of perfect contentment. The man who had once believed that love was a luxury he could no longer afford had discovered instead that love was the foundation upon which everything else of value was built. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities he had never dared to imagine: children to raise, a community to nurture, a ranch to build into something that would benefit not just their own family, but generations of neighbors who would grow up understanding that strength came from connection rather than isolation. In the distance, thunder whinnied from his corral, the sound carrying across the evening air like a blessing on the family that had found its way home to each other through patience, courage, and the transformative power of love that refused to accept that some hearts were too frozen to melt. The man once known as the Glacier had discovered that the warmest fires often burned in the places where ice had once seemed permanent, and that the most beautiful growth happened in soil that had been carefully tended by hands that understood the true meaning of cultivation, partnership, and hope.